This course contains recitations of the Quran in a secular context.
There's a wonderful phrase in Italian that captures the dilemma of approaching the Quran today. Traduttore, traditore. Literally, translator, traitor. Less succinctly, the notion is that any attempt to translate a text from one language to another will involve some level of betrayal to comprehension, meaning, or nuance. Something is always lost in translation. This truism is obviously relevant to the attempt to translate the Quran from Arabic into English or any other language. But it speaks also, I think, to the challenge of translating an oral text into a written text. In the previous lesson, we explored the centrality of oral recitation in the cultural milieu of 7th century Arabia. The Quran was delivered by Muhammad as an oral text for an audience intimately accultured to an oral tradition, meaning his audience heard and even saw the performance of the Quran as an experience quite different from the solitary reading that is our typical experience of text today. As an example of how different the experience of oral recitation versus reading might be, think about how listening to the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. conveys a very different understanding than simply reading his speeches in the quiet of the library. King's tone, tenor, cadence, his crescendos and pronunciations all convey meaning in their own right, and all are lost in the dryness of the written word. Or think of the annual State of the Union address in the United States and how the president's audience factors into the rhetorical effect of the speech. The Quran is no different, and indeed, I think is much more enriched by hearing it than even the speeches of Dr. King or a State of the Union address. The oral recitation of the Quran remains central to Muslim religious experience today. Schools of recitation are well established and contests are regularly held for reciters. Even if one does not understand Arabic, the recited Quran conveys an emotional resonance that is impossible to capture on the page. Let's take, for example, Surah 100, which reads in English, "In the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, by the charging steeds that pant and strike sparks with their hooves, who make dawn raids, raising a cloud of dust, and plunging into the midst of the enemy. Man is ungrateful to his Lord, and he is witness to this. He is truly excessive in his love of wealth. Does he not know that when the contents of graves are thrown out, when the secrets of hearts are uncovered, on that day their Lord will be fully aware of them all?" Compare that to the auditory experience of the same text by a professional reciter.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعاديات ضبحا فالموريات قضحا فالمغيرات صبحا فأثرن به نقعا فوسطن به جمعا إن الإنسان لربه لكنود وإنه على ذلك لشهيد وإنه لحب الخير لشديد أفلا يعلم إذا بعثر ما في القبور وحصل ما في الصدور إن ربهم بهم يومئذ لخبير.
Because of the structure of Arabic as a language, there are elements of the text that are nearly impossible to recreate in English, including alliteration and rhyme. But the tradition of Quranic recitation also emphasizes a kind of plaintive yearning, a feature of the text that is only illuminated as an oral phenomenon. Aside from the experiential difference between the oral and written Quran, we are faced with three other problems. First, during the time of Muhammad, Arabic was not yet a fully developed script. That is, the Arabic language was complex and sophisticated, but the orthographic mechanisms for transforming or translating spoken Arabic into a written form were underdeveloped. The earliest extant fragments of the written Quran known today are composed in something called the Hijazi script, which, while visually arresting, is deficient for reading. It lacks diacritics for vowels and other markings like punctuation, useful for deciphering not just meaning, but differentiating even one letter from another. Another early script used for fragments of the Quran is called Kufic, which suffers from similar drawbacks, and is likewise difficult to read for anyone not trained in ancient Arabic manuscripts. The net effect is that our earliest evidence for the written Quran is rife with potential interpretive problems. Words that share letters but have wildly different meanings are difficult to decipher. An example in English might be the words grape, gripe, grope, and group. When written without vowel indicators, GRP, one might be hard-pressed to determine the exact intent. Certainly, context can help us narrow the possibilities, but we are still left with numerous examples where different readings are feasible. At the same time, these early written manuscripts were not meant to be read as we read texts today. Instead, they were an aide-mémoire, a kind of mnemonic device for reciters who already knew the text, but could benefit from an occasional reminder. I'll have more to say about the transformation of Arabic as a written language shortly, but our takeaway should be that the translation of Muhammad's oral recitation into a written form was complicated and lengthy. Additionally, the composition of the Quran as a text has a history. The journey from early fragments into a cohesive whole accepted by the broader community, that is complicated as a theological matter. Believing Muslims maintain that the Quran as we have it today, at least in Arabic, is a perfect representation of God's message delivered to Muhammad and then proclaimed to 7th century Mecca and Medina. However, textual and literary scholars cast doubt upon the reliability of this assertion. The archaeological evidence suggests that, while many parts of the Quran were written down in some form within the first decades following Muhammad's death, it took many years for the Quran to emerge as a complete, finalized, and universally accepted document. So the religious claims about the authenticity and exactness of the Quran as God's word are challenged by our documentary evidence. Could any changes or variations to the text have been introduced in the intervening years between Muhammad's life and the final codification of the Quranic text some decades later? As I've suggested earlier, this might not necessarily concern us. It might be enough to say that Muslims today accept the standard form of the Quran as accurately reflecting Muhammad's message. And thus, we can read the text as we have it without needing to chase the fool's errand of discerning absolute historical fidelity. However, many theological debates, both between Muslims as a broad community and between Muslims and non-Muslims, often hinge on this question of textual reliability. While my approach is to take the Quran as it is today, the fact that the Quran's accuracy as a text is a subject of debate can and should inform our discussion of it. Our final problem regards how we all encounter the text today, and especially for non-Arabic speakers. As is the case in any act of translation, source languages lose their complexity and illusion in translation. You might think of this as the challenge of translating a pun or a joke. Such figures of speech are notoriously difficult to translate because they so often rely upon double meanings, cognates, or figurative references for effect. One can literally translate a joke, but the joke itself is nearly always lost in the process. In the same vein, the Arabic of the Quran is rich, dense, and filled with linguistic allusions, qualities that are inevitably sacrificed in the process of translation. With all of this in mind, we can say that there are four main issues of translation that concern us here. 1. The experiential difference between an oral text and a written text. 2. The literary problem of transforming an oral text into a written text. 3. The theological question of whether we can accept the Quranic text as we have it today as an accurate reflection of Muhammad's recitation. And finally, the contemporary problem of translation, how non-Arabic readers can encounter a text that is deeply reliant upon its source language for meaning and nuance. Let's take each of these 4 points in turn. One of the most remarkable features of the Quran as an historical document is the evidence we have for early written forms of the text. Some of the partial manuscripts date to the early 8th century, and some fragmentary writings date to the late and even mid-7th century. In other words, it's obvious that people were committing the revelation to the written page at the latest within 50 years of the Prophet's death. There is scholarly dispute, of course, about how we ought to consider the various fragments and pages still preserved. While the details of these disputes needn't concern us here, a few general considerations should be noted. First, and as I've already mentioned, early written forms of the Quran appear in either what is called the Hijazi or Kufic scripts. In both cases, these scripts lack the linguistic markings of modern Arabic, and thus present various historical challenges. Was there any dispute about the meaning of particular words? Were some passages eventually excluded from what became the standardized text? Were some passages not authentic to Muhammad? In short, was anything lost or anything added in the journey from the original recitation to the final form? While we cannot definitively answer these questions, we can adopt what scholar Michael Sells calls a theologically neutral stance towards the text, where debate about authorship becomes secondary to the text itself. As he describes this, such attributions, now also common for the Bible, allow for a text to be discussed without constant and tendentious assumptions about its authorship. I think it's useful to assume this position, at least for the time being. In doing so, we can focus on how the Quran was experienced in its earliest formative decades. As I mentioned earlier, the written fragments of the recitation were created for a specific and practical reason, as aids for the public recitation of Muhammad's message, so that others might hear and perhaps memorize for themselves the revelation. Such public recitals were especially important following Muhammad's death in 632. The audience for this revelation was particular and specific in terms of their sophisticated appreciation for orality. It should be no surprise, then, that the Quran in recited Arabic plays upon that expectation. Again, turning to Michael Sells from his important work, Approaching the Quran. The complex Quranic sound patterns and the relation of sound to meaning, what we might call the sound vision of the Quran, are brought out and cultivated in Quranic recitation. No translation can fully capture this sound vision, a lyricism comparable to that of the Psalms. It's useful, I think, to again have an auditory experience of what Professor Sells is referencing. In this case, here is Surah 94 in English. Did we not relieve your heart for you, and remove the burden that weighed so heavily on your back, and raise your reputation high? So truly, where there is hardship, there is also ease. Truly, where there is hardship, there is also ease. So when you are free, work on and direct your requests to the Lord. Now, let's listen to that same passage in Arabic.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم نشرح لك صدرك ووضعنا عنك وزرك الذي أنقض ظهرك ورفعنا لك ذكرك فإن مع العسر يسرا إن مع العسر يسرا فإذا فرغت فانصب وإلى ربك فارغب.
There is something in the stylized recitation of the Quran that is impossible to convey in either the written Arabic or in any translation, no matter its literary felicity. All the more reason, then, that the early written forms of the Quran capture the recitation as precisely as possible. The Hijazi and Kufic scripts mentioned earlier began to give way to ever more sophisticated representations of the Arabic language. In this way, the development of the Quran as a written text was ineluctably related to the oral recitation of it. The early fragmentary crib sheets quickly morphed into devices for spreading the text, and ever greater orthographic detail and precision was necessary so that the memory of a companion of Muhammad might be accurately transmitted to those who did not have the advantage of first-hand listening. As a result, during the course of perhaps 150 years following Muhammad's death, the writing of Arabic evolved in order to assure the accurate transmission of the oral phenomenon. Similar to how the works of Shakespeare are often credited with inventing English as a modern language, the Quran in this sense forced the invention of modern written Arabic. At the same time, very few people, either in Arabia or globally in the 7th and 8th centuries, could read. While this might seem like a problem from our point of view, the practical effect was that the dissemination of the Quran in both oral and written forms was tightly controlled by scholars who had worked hard to master the text in both its forms. The written texts were always at the service of the communal experience of reciting the revelation aloud to an audience. And the recitation itself likewise developed schools of transmission to ensure accuracy. The takeaway here is that the experience of the Quran as an oral phenomenon dictated the terms by which the Quran became a written text. The shape of that text, however, is our next subject. I don't mean to belabor the issue of the development of the Quran as it parallels the development of written Arabic, but it's difficult to overstate its importance. Following the death of Muhammad, his close followers, those people who become the so-called companions of the Prophet, had to address the issue of how they were to maintain and spread his message. As I mentioned earlier, the tradition holds that Muhammad was illiterate, meaning at least that he did not write down the revelations himself. In addition to Muhammad's own memory, his companions had taken to trying to memorize the revelation, and it's said that one of Muhammad's wives, Aisha, possessed written versions of some of the revelations. But there was no composed, written, final version of the Quran in existence at the time of Muhammad's death. In this sense, our historical record aligns with the tradition. The Quran was not yet a book in the modern sense when Muhammad died. And it's evident that Muhammad's companions recognized this as a problem. At this point, however, the story becomes murky and contested. Some hold that Muhammad's political successor, Abu Bakr, began to collect different fragments of the text. Perhaps the second successor, Umar, did the same. Most Muslims agree, however, that it was the third successor, Uthman, who, given the rapidly expanding empire newly under Arab control, grew concerned that there were discrepancies being introduced into the revelation. After all, military conquests had stretched the reach of a newly united Arab polity into Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and beyond. This wide geographic sprawl meant that those who were closest to the Prophet weren't able to monitor and correct the spread of Muhammad's message. What would happen if the success of the revelation led ultimately to its corruption? The tradition in Islam holds that at this point Uthman deputized Zayd ibn Thabit to collect, correct, and preserve the revelation. Thabit is said to have served as Muhammad's scribe in addition to having memorized numerous revelations himself. By asking Thabit to gather and sort all recorded and remembered versions of the revelation, Uthman hoped to enshrine Muhammad's message in an uncontested form. Thabit's efforts apparently included gathering any written versions he could locate, as well as interviewing and recording memorized portions of the revelation from trusted followers of Muhammad. Weeding out specious or disparate lines, Thabit assembled a final compilation known as the Uthmanic Codex, copies of which are said to have been distributed to the major cities in the rapidly expanding empire. Thus, according to traditional accounts, the initial Iqra had become Al-Quran, the recitation. This process was theoretically completed less than 25 years after the death of Muhammad, a remarkably short amount of time in terms of religious history. And in this way, Uthman and Thabit saved the revelation from corruption. Unless, of course, that isn't the whole story. Here we encounter a major obstacle. There is no verifiable edition of Uthman's Codex still available to us. In fact, there is no existing whole and complete copy of the Quran until the early 10th century, some 300 to 400 years after the Prophet's death. What we do have, and it is a remarkable treasure in the aggregate, are pages and pages of the recitation, often loose-leafed and incomplete, though also highly standardized, written upon vellum, palm leaves, and early paper, inscribed in stone or painted onto decorative tiles, including within the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. These were the sorts of written versions that Zayd ibn Thabit would have been collecting in his effort to construct the whole of the Quran. Checked against his own memory or that of others, it would have been theoretically possible to collate an edition of the text that came relatively, perhaps even nearly perfectly, close to Muhammad's utterances. But again, we have no copy of Thabit's efforts. To be blunt, the literary question of the Quran hinges on the discrepancy between what tradition holds about Zayd ibn Thabit's collecting and standardizing efforts versus the evidence available to us. There is a historical gap of some 200 years between the earliest fragments of the Quran and a complete version of the text that corresponds to the Quran we know today. But lack of evidence isn't evidence to the contrary. Indeed, the fragments of the Quran we do have, including manuscripts only found in the 1970s in the attic of a Yemeni mosque, illustrate a high degree of correlation. In short, while the textual evidence for the Quran is incomplete, it is remarkably consistent in form and structure. Likely you're thinking, could this really be possible? Would not the text have already been terribly changed in the 20+ years between Muhammad's death and Thabit's collating efforts? Not to mention the centuries that passed before indisputable evidence for a complete Quran? Perhaps. But we must also remember that memorization of text was the common practice at the time. Before broad literacy, before books were commonplace items, it was entirely reasonable for people to remember verbatim long passages of text that we today would be hard-pressed to recall. And, in fact, a good many Muslims still today make it a practice to memorize the whole of the Quran. One can learn the Quran by heart. During his time, no one would have thought Thabit's endeavor was impossible or unlikely on the face of it. At the same time, there is evidence of variant readings, some of them also attributed to close and trusted companions of the Prophet, that did not make the final version of Uthman's Codex. Why was this? What are we to do with this information? Did Thabit manage to collect all or even nearly all of the Prophet's revelation? Or did editing occur? Were some verses or words changed or left out in order to support differing political or theological agendas? Again, we can't answer these questions with certainty, but we now have a sense of how the text evolved from fragmentary pieces into a cohesive whole. The solution, whether at the hand of Thabit or some later, more gradual compendium, was to create thematically organized chapters called surahs. We've encountered a few of these already. Some of them are clearly whole and complete moments of revelation, while others are pastiches of different revelatory moments. What belonged with what, and who decided? The answer is unclear, but a rough outline has been deduced. In general, Muhammad's prophetic career is divided into two parts. The first is the 12-year period from the start of the revelation until he and his followers fled to the safety of a neighboring city, Yathrib, known today as Medina. These so-called Meccan passages bear the hallmark of the burden Muhammad faced in converting Mecca's resistant citizens. They are often pleading in character, seemingly bereft at the unwillingness of the audience to listen to their clear warning. Tonally, at least, there is general consensus about those revelations that come from the start of Muhammad's prophetic career. Once the revelations were sorted into chapters, the question of order came next. Aside from Al-Fatiha, the brief, evocative opening chapter of the Quran, the final order is roughly from longest to shortest. That is, Surah 2 is a lengthy and holistic exposition on social engineering, and each subsequent chapter is generally a smaller and smaller unit. The final 20 or so surahs are so short as to be nearly aphoristic, poetic in character, and rich with imagery. And it just so happens these shorter surahs typically correspond to the Meccan period of revelation. So, if you wanted to recreate a roughly chronological order to the text, you might begin at the end and read forward into the text as you grow accustomed to longer and longer passages. Doing so can help trace, albeit imprecisely, the chronological evolution of Muhammad's prophetic career. I'm guessing you think that order according to length is a strange way to organize a book. However, aside from one surah, the chapter on Joseph, there is no narrative arc followed from beginning to end in the Quran. Even the lengthier Medinian surahs, that is, those revealed after the migration to Medina, often jump from topic to topic. That is to say, the Quran is not meant to be read as we read modern books, from front cover to back, but instead was always understood as a text you can dip into, one where order or context of revelation is not necessary to understanding its meaning. Indeed, when children first learn the Quran, they always begin at the end, if for no other reason than the shorter surahs are easier to memorize. It might also surprise you to learn that organization according to length was a fairly common practice at the time. For example, in the New Testament, the letters of Paul are organized both thematically and generally by length, not in terms of their chronological composition. In both the Quran and the New Testament epistles, when they were composed or written is not the prevailing factor in where they appear in the text. Indeed, many of Paul's letters were likely written before any of the four Gospels achieved their final state. So, we've now addressed two parts of the translation process, from Muhammad's original utterances to a completed text. First, the oral recitation was written down in ever more elaborate orthographic form, corresponding to the development of Standard Arabic. Second, these written forms were collected into a cohesive whole, which, although the exact contours of its collection are debated, leaves us with a written and ordered text that is held by the Muslim community to be the complete and unadulterated rendition of Muhammad's original revelation. This belief about the text is fascinating, but leaves me, and I would guess you, with a lot of questions. Didn't the revelation come to Muhammad during a very particular time and in a very particular place? Does it not reflect that historical time and culture during which it was first recited? Were the words uttered by Muhammad ibn Abdullah nearly 1400 years ago perfectly transposed in the editions we can buy or read online? To ask these questions and to give credence to some of the scholarly objections to the traditional account, as I have, is to suggest that the Quran has a history. And to say the Quran has a history is to engage in a theological dispute. Why is that? Well, it wasn't always the case, but over time, the orthodox view about the Quran became that the text was God's eternal and uncreated speech. Eternal meaning that it has always existed, and uncreated meaning its final form, the Arabic version we have today, was not the work of human hands. The position of the Muslim community is that the Quran as we have it today is the inerrant word of God as transmitted to the Prophet Muhammad. To be clear, this inerrancy is most directly attributed to the oral version of the Quran, at least in the sense that this was the original mechanism for transmission. The written Quran is a reflection of, and thus secondary to, the oral text. That's the theological stance. The scholarly opinion is more mixed. While there is a great degree of uniformity among the early fragments of the Quran, the variations that are known, and the lack of evidence between the earliest folios and the finished product introduce sufficient doubt that the Quran as we know it is inerrantly reflective of Muhammad's message. That there is scholarly skepticism is, I think, to be expected. But the questions raised will become important as we elaborate on the meaning and purpose of the text. For instance, did cultural assumptions about social norms infiltrate the text in ways that allow us to dismiss some elements of the text? Or, if not, how are we to understand passages that seem to allude to specific historical situations? In this sense, the history of the Quran as a book has bearing on the interpretive tradition of the text. We'll be exploring this in greater depth as this course continues. But, as I tried to make clear earlier, perhaps the tension between tradition and historical evidence doesn't matter. That is, whether or not the printed text of the Quran as we have it today is perfectly representative of Muhammad's message is less important than the fact that billions of Muslims have believed it to be so. Today, the Quran can be found in numerous translations, readily available on the internet, as cheaply mass-produced copies, or crafted into exquisite art pieces. But the Quran can also be profoundly confusing, especially for first-time readers. It's abundantly clear that parts of the Quran we have today were in wide circulation, well known and agreed upon very early within the tradition's history. But we cannot know that the whole of the text is perfectly representative of the words recited by Muhammad, and we will never know this with absolute certainty. Today, we have a text shared by the nearly 2 billion Muslims the world over. Only a fraction of Muslims read and speak Arabic, however, so it is in translation that a great many Muslims and non-Muslims alike encounter the Quran. The text has been translated into a majority of the world's languages, and in the case of English, dozens of times. These translations all grapple with the history of the Quran as a text in different ways. And perhaps this is as it should be. From an historian's point of view, I think it is reasonable to conclude that the final version of the Quran is the result of human effort. It was collated and collected and perhaps edited by people working in the wake of Muhammad's legacy. Indeed, many elements of the text that are today assumed, chapter divisions and titles, verse number indicators, are clearly ipso facto inventions. Even if we assume the very best of intentions of Thabit and whoever followed him in the construction of the Quran, it's clear that editorial and thus interpretive decisions were made. Whatever the case may be, we have now arrived at our final canonized text of the Quran. After the prayer-like opening surah, a series of chapters in roughly descending length, which themselves roughly correspond, inversely, to the chronology of their revelation. Subsequent scribes would add verse breaks along with other grammatical interventions, as well as titles for each chapter. All of this contributed to the interpretive tradition of the text, but still the Quran remains an object of dispute and question. What we will embark on next is a thorough examination of the text in its details, beginning with the earliest passages delivered to Muhammad in Mecca and proceeding to contemporary debates within the Muslim world. Along the way, we should bear in mind that interpreting any text, especially one whose origins might be divine, is always an act of translation. Something will always be lost, but we must also caution against adding too much of ourselves.